Hi guys. You should watch this lesson after viewing or attending Wednesday, April 15th's live class, um, where we talked about the spaces analysis that we did for the Margaret Thatcher FRQ on the Ronald Reagan eulogy. The next step I want you guys to take to review rhetorical analysis writing is to write an introduction with a claim statement for the Margaret Thatcher eulogy. So in order to refresh our memory a little bit about how to do that, I put together a lesson using one of the FRQs that we've looked at before to show you what good introductions and claim statements look like. So as of 1 o'clock on Wednesday in Google Classroom, you should be able to access this assignment that says Introduction and Claim for Margaret Thatcher Eulogy, and there's two things attached here. One is the Google Slides, and the other one is the prompt. I put together this presentation using the Benjamin Banneker prompt. You might not remember it from trimester 1, but it is the prompt where Benjamin Banneker, who's a former slave, writes to Thomas Jefferson telling him essentially to abolish slavery, that it's hypocritical and wrong. So we went over this one first try and did a lot of work with it, and it's one of my absolute favorites. So I thought I would use that as the example for today's. So I think the first thing that you should do is open up this free response question and just take a few minutes to reread it. So if you want to pause this right now, you can just take like 5 minutes to read this prompt. If you want a little bit more practice with annotation, you could print it out and annotate it as well. I don't have it in Google Docs, so you can't annotate it online. It's just a PDF, but you could print it and annotate it just to remind yourself about what this prompt was about. That'll help have the introductions that you're going to look at make a little bit more sense. So once you've done that, you can come back to the video here, and then you're going to open up the presentation here, which looks like this. And this is a presentation that we actually went through back in first trimester, but it's edited to fit this prompt. So it's a little bit updated for this. So the instructions on that FRQ, if I can see over my cat here, were to read the excerpt from the letter and write an essay that analyzes how Banneker uses rhetorical strategies to argue against slavery. So pretty similar to the one for Margaret Thatcher, just a little more specific here. What I have here are 4 sample introductions that scored between a 7, 8, and 9 out of 9 on the old scale. So these are higher scoring essays. They're just the introductions and claim statements with them. And as we get from the 7 to the 9s, you'll start to see that they get a little bit stronger. Just keep in mind, as usual, when we're looking at samples, that we're only seeing the introduction, so we don't see the whole essay to know exactly why it got the score that it did. But looking at this one, it says, in 1971, African-American Benjamin Banneker wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson in an effort to persuade Jefferson to see the injustice of slavery. Banneker uses emotional and logical appeal, allusions to historical events and biblical stories, and a retrospective and respectful yet critical tone to argue against slavery. So this one's pretty short, and the first sentence I don't really like that much because it's repetitive of the prompt and it doesn't provide much new context, but I think the claim is a good example here for the fact that it characterizes the devices really well and it's very straightforward. What it could do better is to be a lot more specific about author's purpose, because this is basically just what the prompt said. But before that, the way it discusses the rhetorical devices is strong. So you can use that part of it as a good example. Moving on to the one that scored an 8, they said, whether we like to think about it or not, slavery is associated with our country's history. There have been several opinions on its constitutional fairness, but nevertheless it happened, and eradicating it from the nation was a struggle. During this struggle, Benjamin Banneker took a huge step and wrote Thomas Jefferson about his negative feelings on the issue of slavery, in which he implemented several religious appeals, repetition, and an array of emotional diction. This one's stronger in the fact that it has a lot better context. It's not repetitive of the prompt. It also does a pretty good job of discussing the rhetorical choices that this writer is going to use in their essay. Again, it could be a little bit stronger about author's purpose. His negative feelings on the issue of slavery is not super specific. So in these two that scored a 9, we'll see them do a little bit better at that. So this first one that scored a 9, Benjamin Banneker, in a letter to Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, maintains a firm position on the injustice of slavery in the United States in 1791. Banneker humbles himself before Jefferson to remind the founding father of the oppressed conditions of the colonies under Great Britain's control and draws a parallel to the current plight of slaves. The author encourages Jefferson and other supporters of slavery to try to relate with these slaves in order to convince them of their hypocrisy in allowing the institution of slavery. We've got a really nice sentence of context before our claim. And then here they kind of have a 2-sentence claim that's a little bit more complex. They start to get into rhetorical strategies here when they talk about Banneker humbling himself before Jefferson and drawing a parallel to the current plight of the slaves. Those are both rhetorical choices that they're mentioning there. They are much more specific about the author's purpose here than the other two were. So this is a really good example. It's also a chronologically structured essay, so you can see that they don't get super specific about the rhetorical choices they're going to discuss. That's allowing them to keep it kind of open so that they can discuss chronologically how Banneker does this throughout the entire essay. And here's one more that scored a 9. Hundreds of years ago, slavery ran rampant through America, especially in the southern states. Slaves were thought to be essential for day-to-day life, on plantations as field workers or in houses as maids. They often were subjected to cruel treatment, undergoing abuse and even death at the hands of their slaveholders. In 1791, Benjamin Banneker wrote to Thomas Jefferson in an effort to convince him of the cruelties of slavery. Banneker, by asking Jefferson to look back on his time under the rule of Great Britain and by focusing on Jefferson's hypocrisy on the subject of slavery, attempts to convince Jefferson that slavery is corrupt and that by opening their minds, Americans can escape these prejudices against slaves. I think this is the strongest of the 4 intros. For one, it's got a lot of context. Oh, well, don't want to move that. Just wanted to highlight. It's got a lot of context here. You probably don't absolutely need this much, but if you've got the time, it's not a bad idea to give a little bit more of that context if you have the historical knowledge, if it's a passage that you can write a lot about. That might be something that puts, you towards that sophistication point. And then the claim here is 2 sentences. Well, the first sentence is kind of just a lead into the claim. The claim is really here and is really specific. So they mention kind of 2 more general devices, asking Jefferson to look back and focusing on Jefferson's hypocrisy. That's because this person also did a chronologically structured essay, so they're not talking about just, 3 very specific rhetorical choices or leaving it more open. But they do a really good job getting specific into author's purpose here, probably saying it as well as any one can say it. So that's really, I think, the more important piece is that you get specific about author's purpose. That's going to lead you to those higher scoring essays. So 2 major parts to your intro here. One is the brief contextualizing information before your claim. You can keep it brief. 2 to 4 sentences is plenty. You've got 45 minutes, 5 more minutes than you used to have to write this. So you don't want to spend, 10 minutes just writing context. You want to get into the analysis. If it is a historical passage, you can talk about the historical background information that you might know about it. If it's something political, like for instance, this Margaret Thatcher passage, you could talk about that. Anything cultural, anything that you know that you can bring in here is a good place to do it. You definitely want to identify who the author's intended audience is somewhere in the intro. So that's either going to be in this context or it's going to be in your claim. Okay. And you don't want to just repeat the prompt. We saw that in that 7 scoring essay, that it just sounded repetitive of the prompt. 1, it's a waste of your time. 2, it doesn't impress the readers at all. So then moving on to the more important thing here is the claim statement. We know from our rubric that one of your 6 points comes from this sentence alone or 2 sentences. So we really want to make sure we do a very, very strong claim. The rubric specifically says the thesis responds to the prompt rather than restating or rephrasing the prompt, and clearly articulates a defensible thesis about the rhetorical choices the writer makes. Note that it does say a defensible thesis, meaning you're saying something a little more original than just, Margaret Thatcher uses rhetorical choices in her eulogy. That's obvious. That's not defensible. So you got to make sure you say something about her rhetorical choices and her purpose. You want to keep this to probably 1 to 2 sentences. If you're getting longer than 2 sentences, you're probably getting too specific. Save that for the actual essay. You should include the rhetorical choices that you intend to analyze, but if you're doing a chronologically structured analysis, these can be more generally summarized, like the ones we saw in those 9 essays. Or you can just pick like 2 to 3 big ones that you know you're going to discuss a lot without necessarily saying that you're not going to discuss other ones too. Most importantly, it should summarize the author's main purpose in the best words that you can. You may also include an identification of the author's audience if you haven't done that elsewhere in your intro. So looking at these claim statements from the ones that we just looked at here, what I did was just highlighted in different colors where the author does each of these things. So you can see that this 7 claim statement really, really hits the rhetorical choice as well. I really like how they characterize them, but they don't talk much about purpose. This 8 claim statement has a little more about purpose, but again, it's kind of general, states the rhetorical choices, has the author or the audience. As we get into these ones that score a 9, you can see that there's a shift. There's a lot more green on these because the writer spends a lot more time talking about purpose than they do about rhetorical choices. And that's really, I think, the more important thing here. They still make it clear that this is a rhetorical analysis, that they do see some rhetorical choices in the essay, but they really talk more about purpose. And this one too is nice because it recognizes that Jefferson was not the only intended audience here, that probably more people would read this. So that shows a little bit more sophistication as well. You can see the same thing here, that our discussion of the author's purpose is much longer than you saw in the other lower scoring essays. So it does a much better job there. So keeping all of that in mind, I want you to practice this using the Margaret Thatcher prompt. So your assignment is to take the spaces analysis that you already completed, all your annotations that you did, all the work that you did on these pages and that we just worked through in our live class, and write an introduction for that essay. So an introduction with a strong claim statement. So you want to have your contextualizing information and then your strong claim with your rhetorical choices and the author's purpose. I'd like you to get this done by Monday. We're going to have our next live class on Monday, April 20th at 11 a.m. So kind of this will be our trial run for like our normal class time. That'll be, we'll be starting Mondays and Wednesdays the week of the 27th. So I want you to get it done before class, and then during class, I'm going to ask for some people to share theirs. We'll do some workshopping and critiquing of them, and then you'll make some edits to them that'll be due later on in the week. So share it with me by 10:30. You can submit it via Google Classroom, but you're going to have to unsubmit it anyway so that you can do some workshopping on it. So it's best just to share it with me via Google Docs, and then you can submit your final revised copy via Google Classroom on Wednesday. I think I have it due on Wednesday. I'll check on that. Ooh. I don't know. Whenever it's due, I'll let you know. It'll be posted on the Google Classroom. But yeah, so right now for today, just worry about this due date. Monday, April 20th, 10:30. So about a half an hour before class starts, so that you're ready to go. And then at the 11 a.m. class, we'll talk about these. Okay. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to send me an email, text, whatever, and I can try to answer them for you. And if you can't make the live class on Monday, just let me know if you want a little bit more individualized help, and we'll try to set up a time that we can conference about your particular introduction. All right. See ya.